Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have another hero of Brexit, Sir Bill Cash, who did an amazing job on the European Scrutiny Committee for many years, as Kelvin mentioned. And actually, he was so successful that they abolished the committee, which is pretty disgraceful. But without any further ado, Sir Bill Cash.
Thank you very much indeed. I just thought I'd thank, first of all, everybody who's spoken already, because we've had some exceptional speeches. I'd also like to just refer to this, which is what I met in the tube last night when I arrived at Euston. UK faces summer limbo. As Streeting says, we must be back in the EU. I think some people have forgotten that Andy Burnham, in September last year at a fringe conference, made the same kind of remarks. So I think that's something which we need to bear in mind. And I'm extremely glad that there are Labour members of Parliament here as well. And I'll mention them in a minute. So I've been asked to speak on how sovereignty came to be embedded in our legislation, Section 38 of the Withdrawal Agreement Act. And therefore, much of what I've heard today about sovereignty and democracy are equivalent because they're intertwined. Sovereignty is democracy. If you have real sovereignty, you have a democratic parliament. So I'd also like to say that it's been a brilliantly timed conference, and I'd like to pay tribute to David Campbell Bannerman and to the Freedom Association, and also to the late Simon Richards, who used to write to me frequently, encouraging me as the 4 decades went by when I was in Parliament from 1984 to 2024 when I retired. I'd also like to pay tribute to a pretty diverse but consistent group of people such as David Jones. We're all from political parties these days, it seems, different ones, but never mind. All centrally focused on one main question. We have David Jones, John Redwood, Ian Duncan Smith, Mark Francois, Andrew Rossendale, Dan Heenan, Kate Hoey, Kelvin Hopkins, Graham Stringer, Maurice Glassman for the House of Lords, and if I may say also, Jim Alistair, who's done a tremendous job in the real work that's been going on, which I will try and deal with briefly in relation to the statutory instruments. Now, I'd like also to mention Dan Boucher. I hadn't realised I was sitting next to him until he's tremendously important in all this. I'd also like to mention, if I may, Tony Benn, who apparently said I was the only member of Parliament from the Conservative Party he'd ever go on the platform with. And that did take place on a couple of times in Trafalgar Square way back in the early 1990s during Maastricht. And of course, Peter Shaw, who hasn't been mentioned yet, and Brian Gould, who is very much alive and living in New Zealand. I just wanted to get this right because, and Maurice Glassman too, this is something which transcends the political divisions and the differences in political parties. And I think it's important in a meeting of this importance, so well historically timed, David, thank you very much, to make that clear. So in 1984, I've been asked to speak about how this sovereignty came about and what happened. Some of it will be familiar to the members of Parliament, but to others it may not be so obvious. And I have to say I am writing my memoirs at the moment, so I shall have 1 or 2 things to mention as well. So in May 1984, I was elected as MP for Stafford in a by-election. And I was very shortly afterwards appointed to the European Scrutiny Select Committee, which has been mentioned. I then sat on that committee for 40 years, not 4, but 40 years. I became chairman in 2010 and remained so until I retired in 2024. When I was put on the committee, I discovered a vivid truth, which was that under the European Community Act 1972, which was enacted without a referendum, of course, of voters, the Westminster Parliament had become a rubber stamp, subjugating its own lawmaking in vast swathes of EU treaty legislation passed at Westminster and by mind-numbing statutory instruments that nobody ever really looked at, but which actually produced thousands of UK laws which were enforceable in our courts. And that these laws had been made by the European institutions, namely the European Community, the Commission, and the Council of Ministers. And that Council of Ministers sat making our laws through the Council of Ministers by our agreement in the European Communities Act, invariably by majority vote, through a forced consensus and without even so much as a transcript. There's no transcript whatsoever. And of course, we have one every day in Hansard so that everybody can see who is accountable and how the laws are made and who is responsible. So this so appalled me, it was a matter of weeks, but in early 1985, I decided at any price, and I really mean at any price, I would try to reverse this constitutional and undemocratic aberration, undermining our constitutional history and our democracy, which has been discussed so eloquently by a number of people already. So in June 1986, observing that the European community was increasing its competences with qualified majority vote by as many as 300 policy areas, all majority vote, I explained to Margaret Thatcher in private my deepest concerns. I was a bit of a sort of new squid. I'd only just come into Parliament and I was being a little bit presumptuous, but she seemed to want to ask me some questions. And latterly, she did come to realise that she had been deceived over the Single European Act and said so in her book called Statecraft, which is somewhat written by Niall Gardner. If he's here at the moment, I think he'll remember all that. Anyway, I put down an amendment, the temerity of it, put down an amendment in June 1986. 86. Please note, Nigel Farage. And nothing in this act, it said, or in any enactment construed or incorporated with this act, whether coming into force before or after this act, shall be deemed to have derogated at any time from the sovereignty of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, notwithstanding any treaties or laws made in respect of European Union. In other words, it was a direct challenge in June 1986 to the whole of this EU project. I argued from the backbenches, and this is in Hansard, that we would reap the whirlwind if we get this wrong. I demanded, and I'm quoting from the actual speech I discovered the other day, I wanted to know how we will be governed. Would it be the European Commission, the European institutions, or the European Court, I asked, or all? And I said it should be our own elected members in Parliament who should do this. I was then told by the Deputy Speaker, in no uncertain terms, that this was not for debate, despite my protests, which I made several times, to the point of almost being thrown out of the chamber, which simply hardened my resolve that I would not be silenced. My relationship with Margaret Thatcher deepened, and she would frequently consult me in private one-to-one meetings, but her difficulty was immense because she was surrounded by Heathites, such as Geoffrey Howe, Douglas Hurd, and others, who had all been behind the prospect and behind the enactment of the European Community Act 1972. And she, of course, was ultimately politically assassinated by them all in November 1990. John Redwood, by the way, who's sitting there, put up a huge fight from inside, but actually the truth is that they were never going to listen to any of us at that point. John Major took over, and although I was re-elected to the Conservative Backbench Committee for European Affairs, and I have to emphasise, by secret ballot. Very important. Nobody knew who was voting. I got fulsome support from 64% of the backbenchers. It was a pretty surprise. It came as a big surprise to the government, by all accounts. And because they had listened to what I was trying to say, despite the manipulation and engineering of the whips in the government. There were people on the other side of the House, and I've mentioned Peter Shaw, Tony Benn, Brian Gould and the others, and of course Kate Hoey, Kelvin Hopkins. So this is all about something bigger than political parties. It's about fundamental principles. Jim Allister, who's doing a huge job in relation to Northern Ireland likewise. So in 1992-93, I set up the Maastricht referendum campaign with Margaret Thatcher as patron to break the collusion between the two front benches. They wanted to perpetuate our being in what John Major in March 1991, in Germany, described as being in the very heart of Europe. I think I heard that a few days ago from Keir Starmer. Ha ha. Good warning, I'd say. And with the help of magnificent colleagues, some of whom are here today, set up the bulwark of rebellion in Great College Street, number 17, from which we harried the government incessantly for month after month with hundreds of amendments over our surrender to the European institutions. I then formed the European Foundation in 1993, of which Margaret Thatcher also became patron, and we have now renamed it this year the United Kingdom Sovereignty Foundation, situated only 25 yards from where we're sitting here across in Tufton Street. And its objectives are, in law, to promote, consolidate and preserve the sovereignty, self-government and democracy of the United Kingdom and its Parliament, and the continuing arrangements for the completion of the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union. I sketch all this out because it was a rebellion for sovereignty and self-government, and nothing, you might have noticed, was ever going to stop me, or the others who I was working with. Because sovereignty is democracy, we had to stop the undemocratic surrender and subjugation of the mother of parliaments, as my forebear John Bright described it, which is at the very heart of our centuries-old constitutional history. As it evolved, you may be interested to know, if you don't already, from 1660, when we repealed all the Cromwellian legislation. And then, of course, in 1689, in the Glorious Revolution. These were both as constitutionally momentous as going into the European Union in 1972 actually was, and coming out again in 2020. So I'm glad that Ian Duncan Smith is here and other veterans of the Maastricht debate, some of whom were from the Labour side, as I've said. Margaret's last vote was on one of my many sovereignty and referendum bills over the years before she left the House of Commons. And by then she was completely on side. And I had the opportunity to provide her with constant and consistent advice in the run-up to the Bruges speech in 1988. As time progressed, the Conservative Party became ever more Eurosceptic and Euro-realist, notwithstanding attempts, I have to tell you, many don't know this, serious attempts to deselect me, of course, and the continuing stream of Euro integration treaties that we had to endure, Nice, Amsterdam, Lisbon, under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, then under the Conservative leadership of David Cameron from 2005, he offered a disingenuous cast-iron guarantee of a referendum, which only ultimately materialized in his Bloomberg speech in January 2013 during the coalition government, which in turn, of course, surrendered to his obtuse determination to remain in the European Union. So on 23rd of June 2016, at last, after all those years, the British people gave their verdict to leave the European Union. And I ought to add that I ran my own personal constituency. MPs, for those who don't know, were actually allowed to do it on their own if they wanted to, and I did. And I did it on my own because I wasn't entirely satisfied with the way in which Dominic Cummings was running the Vote Leave operation, but that's another story. So I ran my own personal constituency and regional campaign, and we got 64% vote to leave, which in my view should have been the same for the country as a whole, but that is history. Cameron resigned, then he was succeeded by Theresa May in her Remainer Chequers deal with the Ollie Robbins crew. We defeated them, that is the Spartans, including David Jones, Mark Francois and myself and others, there were about 30 of us all told, to force her to resign. I called her to do so from the backbenches. This was essential because her expression, Brexit means Brexit, was entirely meaningless. We needed to fully regain our sovereignty within the UK, even if tragically it was unfinished business as regards Northern Ireland, as Jim has made so clear, and with the Windsor framework of Rishi Sunak, which I, including David Jones and one or two others, actually voted against, and furthermore, even on the third reading of other bills. I'm very glad that my Sovereignty Foundation did publish Jim Allister's excellent pamphlet a few weeks ago on the Northern Ireland issue. And we did also publish a pamphlet in July 2023. But Chequers had remained substantially in the European framework, and therefore we had to try and throw it out. Despite the determined efforts of the Remainers, when Boris Johnson took over and the paralysis led by Dominic Grieve and others across the floor of the House with Hilary Benn took place, they frustrated Boris's attempts to govern and to deliver what ultimately had to be the referendum result. But eventually the dam burst and Boris stormed to victory in the December 2019 general election. And I recall asking Hilary Benn if he would answer me in Hansard whether he would tell his constituents that he wanted them to be subjugated to European lawmaking and not our own Parliament and himself as a Member of Parliament, but he declined to reply. The Withdrawal Act 2020 followed immediately after the general election, including my Section 38, which asserted the sovereignty of the United Kingdom in words borrowed and almost identical in many respects to my original 1986 amendment, which I was then refused the right to debate, but things had by now moved on. On the critical issue for voters, quite rightly, of illegal migration, which is at the heart of so many of the troubles that are going on at the moment, as Graham Stringer mentioned, there is, however, a major problem. It is that for so many to have forgotten that we have an unwritten constitution. And with that unwritten constitution, and this is crucial to understand, when we present in Parliament legislation for enactment, which is clear and unambiguous, uniquely in the world, we can be sure that the Supreme Court will not prevent our using Parliament by enactment to override international law and other laws, whether it's the European Convention on Human Rights or, in particular, in this instance, the Refugee Convention. And this is not legal waffle. This is the truth. This is at the apex. It is called the principle of legality. And people who don't understand that might usefully have a look to see what the law really is, but I don't blame them if they do, or they don't, because it's actually very, very abstruse legal principle, but it does matter. So on the critical questions, translating these into issues, we have the grooming gangs, we have the cost of education, the cost of the health service, housing. It is an issue resented by a vast number of British voters who have common sense in every single constituency. The failure to deal with this and to disregard my amendment, which I'm afraid Rishi Sunak did, which would have enabled us to deal with it properly, was one of the greatest mistakes he ever made. And he later, after the general election, in an interview with Nick Robinson, admitted that he should have got this right, but he did not. This obsession with international law is ideological. Starmer, Hermer, other Remainers and Rejoiners. In fact, my amendment had been supported by about 80 Conservatives, and eventually 11 of them, including David Jones and myself, even voted against the third reading of the bill. It is worth noting that in the EU, from which we have escaped, Germany, in its own written constitution, legally places international law above and beyond domestic law. So this reset bill, apparently to be called the European Partnership Bill, which I hope is in limbo, like they said here, and the dynamic alignment it employs is a massive strategic attempt led by international lawyers and Starmer to re-engage with the European Union. We haven't yet seen the bill, but the background notes published with the King's Speech clearly indicate that that bill is intended to create a long-term framework for future and ongoing UK-EU agreements, enabling continuing and evolving regulatory alignment through broad powers that allow EU laws to be incorporated into UK law with minimal parliamentary scrutiny. You heard that before. This establishes a continuing mechanism for dynamic alignment whereby UK rules can be updated over time in line with evolving EU law made in the Council of Ministers, right? With minimal interference from parliamentary scrutiny, effectively reversing the fundamental democratic principle and the sovereignty constitutional settlement which underpinned our leaving the EU in 2020. It is like an amoeba. It will expand and evolve the depth of our relationship with the EU. It's serious, it is extremely perfidious, but it is also very deeply rooted, drawing us back not only into alignment but into subjugation to EU lawmaking, as we did in 1972. It's that deep. In that act were the deepest Henry VIII clauses ever conceived in Section 2 of that act. It spawned thousands and thousands of UK laws imposed on us, which we had accepted we could do under the 72 Act, and of course, to which we were subjugated. These were passed by statutory instruments in a way that this legislation will work, and it utterly undermines our sovereignty and the resolution of disputes under that framework which it creates, including ultimate interference by the Court of Justice. The 1972, therefore, took us into an undemocratic Europe through the use of Henry VIII clauses without a referendum. This is how the reset is being reframed. And one of our most famous recent judges, Lord Justice Igor Judge, Lord Chief Justice, and others have called for these Henry VIII clauses to be consigned to the dustbin of history. Well, we shall see. This being the framework, so we're told, of the reset bill, we will be drawn back into the tentacles of this undemocratic European Union. And in fact, the House of Commons, I understand, in the House of Commons, the last occasion that any such statute instrument was actually rejected was in 1979, and in the House of Lords only in the year 2000. So don't get the idea that this reset bill, this is the heart of the problem. We can talk about what we want, we can talk about freedom, we can talk about democracy, but so long as this system continues, it will go on. It has been done before, and they will do it again and again, and they will get their way because they've got a massive majority in the House of Commons. So beware, beware. What makes this even worse, to the shame of the government, is that the European Scrutiny Committee, on which I sat for 40 years, etc., was abolished so that nobody would know what was going on. And when did they do it? Within 20 days of the 2024 general election, so that nobody could know, with zero accountability. This committee had been deliberately created in 1973 to provide transparency and monitor all legislation, which we did, and was chaired successively by Conservative and Labour chairmen. So, in a nutshell, had that been the position regarding the reset bill, we'd had the European Scrutiny Committee, none of this would have been unknown to people. This is a deliberate plot to do it behind closed doors by deceit. Indeed, the Joint Committee on Statutory Instruments, which you might hope would deal with this, has never been focused on EU law. It's always been the task of the European Scrutiny Committee. And all the other committees, the delegated powers committees, all the others, they have inquiries. They have no power to actually do anything really effective. And their power understanding orders as to what is going on is actually yet another democratic black hole in our parliamentary system. It may be rather technical, but it is the way in which it is going on right now. We are being given an opportunity, if we get the chance to do so, to fight this by our combined efforts across party. But what they are doing is using an undemocratic system of enactment to go back into an undemocratic Europe. Now, many have spoken with great eloquence about the OBR, energy emission schemes, gene editing, bioscience, all these things, the emissions trading scheme, all these other things, our contributions will go up and all the rest of it. But this will happen unless we stop this reset bill. So I want to just simply say it is not a reset bill, it's a reconstitution bill, resubjugating us to European legislation and overturning the constitutional settlement of the Withdrawal Agreement 2020 and the retained EU law 2023, and not to mention my sovereignty enactment of Section 38. So I just want to make one last point. You may not know, we haven't heard that today, but many things could have been said, many things ought to be said, many things have been said, and a lot of very useful things have been mentioned. But we have actually escaped, believe it or not, since we left the European Union, 13,000 laws which would otherwise have applied to us. There's the issue of the balance of trade, and others have said we've been bedeviled by lies and distortions regarding all the economies John Redwood so well put it, and others as well. So finally, I just want to say this. Do remember, Sir Paul Lever wrote a book which became the Daily Telegraph and Daily Mail Book of the Year. He was appointed by John Major as the British ambassador to Germany in the late 1990s. He wrote this book, and it was called Berlin Rules. And what he said is as follows, and just bear this in mind, because this is not just a matter for our parliament, it's a matter for everybody in the whole of the European Union. He said, "It is still Germany which controls the EU agenda." I'm quoting, "Others may propose, but in the end, it is German government which will decide. The EU is and will remain a German Europe," which is what I actually said in my own book in 1991, Against the Federal Europe, the Battle for Britain. And in practice, said Sir Paul Lever, it is Germany's view which is sought by the Commission before it acts and by other governments before it decides. So the fight back now has to be intense. It has to be in simple language. We have to explain to the British people, and we will do so, what the undermining of our sovereignty under the Reset Bill really means to the ordinary daily lives of the people of this country. The battle for our sovereignty and for our country and our democracy continues. We will and must never give up, and we must repeal and reverse this Reset Bill. Thank you very much.